My name is Sarah, and today I want to tell you something that has haunted me for years, but also gave me the strength to finally speak up. Imagine walking into a courtroom where every pair of eyes is glued to you, silently questioning your every move. Imagine knowing that the person who once bounced you on his knee as a child, who told you bedtime stories and promised to protect you, is now standing across from you as your enemy. That person was my uncle, a billionaire. A man so powerful that people trembled at the sound of his voice. And yet, here I was, a single woman with nothing but the truth in my hands. The moment the trial began, I could feel the weight of his presence. He sat there in his tailored suit, smirking as though this was just another business deal he was about to win. His lawyers whispered in his ear, their confidence dripping from every glance. And me? My hands trembled, but my heart pounded louder than fear, because I had something that no amount of money could erase. Then it happened. As soon as I opened my mouth, my uncle slammed his fist on the table and shouted across the courtroom, "She lies!" The echo of his voice froze everyone. The jury gasped. Even the judge adjusted his glasses as though he couldn't believe the audacity. In that moment, I felt so small, so fragile, like I was about to be swallowed whole by his power. But what he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the truth had been carefully hidden in documents, waiting for the right time to emerge. And when the judge finally held up those papers, everything changed forever. What I'm about to share with you is not just a story of greed, betrayal, and family secrets. It's also a story of survival, courage, and justice. For years, I kept silent, terrified that no one would believe me against a man whose name carried more weight than the law itself. My uncle wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. At least that's what everyone thought. He controlled companies, politicians, even people in our own family. Speaking out against him felt like signing my own death sentence. But silence is a prison, and I refused to stay locked inside any longer. In this video, I'll take you inside the courtroom where my entire world nearly collapsed. I'll show you the lies he spun, the traps he set, and the lengths he went to protect his empire. But more importantly, I'll reveal the evidence that tore through his fortress of power and forced the truth into the light. You'll see how a man who thought himself invincible was reduced to desperation the moment his lies collided with reality. And trust me, this isn't just about money or inheritance. This is about what happens when someone tries to erase your voice, when they gamble on fear, silencing you forever. Because I stood there, in front of the judge and jury, carrying not just my own truth, but the truth of every person my uncle had crushed under his greed. So if you've ever felt powerless, if you've ever been told your voice doesn't matter, stay with me until the end. What happened in that courtroom will shock you, and maybe, just maybe, it will inspire you. But before we dive into the first chapter of this story, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what comes next. When I was a little girl, my Uncle Michael was larger than life. He wasn't just wealthy, he was magnetic. People adored him at family gatherings, hanging on to every word as though his stories were gospel. I remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet, staring up at him with wide eyes, thinking he was the smartest man in the world. He had this way of making even the simplest thing sound extraordinary, whether it was a business trip or a memory from his youth. Back then, I couldn't imagine him as anything but a hero. But as I grew older, cracks began to appear in the picture-perfect image I had of him. I noticed how conversations in the family shifted the moment he entered the room. Laughter quieted, shoulders stiffened. Even my mother, who prided herself on speaking her mind, became guarded. At first, I thought it was respect, but later, I realized it was fear. Uncle Michael wasn't just rich, he was controlling. And when control slipped from his fingers, he tightened his grip until everyone bent to his will. There were whispers about his businesses, rumors I wasn't supposed to hear. Late at night, I would sneak down the hallway and listen to my parents argue in hushed voices. Words like lawsuits, debt, and fraud floated through the air, but they meant little to me as a teenager. All I knew was that my uncle seemed untouchable, and my parents seemed powerless. Whenever I asked questions, my father would pat my hand and say, "Not now, Sarah. You'll understand when you're older." And I did, but not in the way I ever expected. One memory still burns in my mind. I was 16 when Uncle Michael invited me to his mansion for the weekend. It was the first time I saw the scale of his wealth up close. The marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, the chandeliers that sparkled like frozen fire, the garage lined with cars worth more than our entire house. He walked me through each room with pride, telling me, "This is what success looks like, Sarah. Someday, you'll thank me for showing you how the world really works." At the time, I thought it was a gift. Looking back, it was a warning. Because that weekend, I also saw the other side of him, the temper that flared when a servant brought the wrong wine, the cold way he spoke to his business partner over the phone, the arrogance that turned every conversation into a performance. I remember standing at the top of the staircase, hidden behind the railing, watching him berate an employee until the man's face went pale. The power in his voice wasn't inspiring anymore. It was terrifying. I realized then that his empire wasn't built on brilliance alone. It was built on intimidation. As the years went by, I learned to keep my distance. I went to college, started working, built my own life far from the shadow of his wealth. But no matter how far I tried to run, his presence lingered. Family gatherings turned into minefields. He would corner me with questions about my career, about money, about why I wasn't married yet. Each one dipped in mockery. "You could have had everything, Sarah," he would say with that smug grin. "If only you listened to me." I laughed it off, but inside I felt smaller each time. The turning point came after my parents passed away. Suddenly, everything they owned, the house, the land, the savings, was tied up in paperwork that somehow my uncle had access to. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, stunned, as he explained that Michael had filed claims that didn't make sense. Documents bore signatures I knew weren't my parents'. Dates didn't align, yet somehow the system seemed to lean in his favor. It was like watching a magician pull strings behind a curtain, making reality bend to his will. That was when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. For the first time in my life, I gathered every piece of paper, every record, every clue that proved my uncle was lying. It wasn't easy. There were nights I stayed awake, combing through boxes of documents until my eyes blurred. Some relatives warned me to drop it, whispering that fighting him was dangerous. But I couldn't let fear win. If I gave up, then everything my parents worked for, everything they sacrificed, would be erased by his greed. By the time the case reached the courthouse, I was exhausted but determined. Walking into that room felt like walking into a lion's den, with my uncle at the center, ready to devour me whole. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile that said, "You don't stand a chance." For a moment, I almost believed him. But then I remembered the faces of my parents, their laughter, their love, their endless reminders that integrity mattered more than anything. I carried that with me as armor. The first day of trial was brutal. His lawyers attacked me with questions, twisting my words, painting me as bitter, as ungrateful, as someone fabricating lies for money. My uncle sat there, arms crossed, enjoying the show. But I kept my voice steady, my answers clear, because deep down, I knew something they didn't. The truth was waiting, and when the moment came to reveal it, their empire of lies would crumble. And so, as my uncle raised his voice and called me a liar in front of everyone, I didn't flinch. I knew what was coming. I knew the judge had already seen the documents, and in that instant, my fear began to turn into something else. Resolve. Because the war had just begun, and the real battle was about to unfold in ways no one could predict. The courtroom had its own kind of silence, the heavy kind that pressed against your chest and made it hard to breathe. Every creak of a chair, every shuffle of papers echoed as though the walls themselves were listening. I sat at the plaintiff's table, clutching my pen like it was a lifeline, while across the aisle my uncle leaned back in his chair, radiating confidence. His lawyers were polished and relentless, armed with thick binders and smirks that told me they had already written my defeat in their minds. When the questioning began, it felt like a storm crashing against me. They asked about my childhood, my finances, my relationships, anything they could twist into a weakness. One lawyer leaned in and asked, "Isn't it true, Ms. Turner, that you've had financial struggles? Wouldn't you benefit from painting your uncle as a villain?" My throat tightened, but I looked straight at the jury. "Yes, I've struggled," I admitted, "but that doesn't change the truth. I saw a flicker of discomfort in the lawyer's eyes. They weren't expecting honesty to be my shield. My uncle's performance was something else entirely. When it was his turn to speak, he charmed the room like a seasoned actor. He spoke about how much he loved me as a niece, how devastated he was that I had turned against him, how he only wanted what was best for the family. To anyone who didn't know him, it might have sounded sincere, but I caught the glances, the little smirk he gave me when no one else was watching, the tightening of his jaw when a lawyer mentioned the disputed documents. Beneath the mask of concern, the predator was still there. Each day dragged into the next, and with every session, the pressure grew heavier. Reporters started showing up, scribbling notes and snapping photos. Headlines splashed across local newspapers, painting the case as a family feud worth millions. Strangers whispered in the courthouse halls, their eyes darting toward me, judging, questioning. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with suspicion. I felt exposed, like I was living under a microscope where every flaw in my character would be magnified 100 times. There were nights I went home and collapsed into tears, my body shaking with the weight of it all. I would stare at the boxes of evidence stacked in my living room, wondering if I was strong enough to carry this fight to the end. But then I remembered why I was doing it. I wasn't just protecting my inheritance. I was defending my parents' memory, their sacrifices, their love. That thought became my anchor, the one thing that kept me steady when everything else threatened to pull me under. As the trial progressed, the judge's role became more pronounced. Judge Harris was a man of few words, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He rarely showed emotion, but there were moments when I saw his gaze linger on my uncle just a second too long, as if he was already piecing together the puzzle. It gave me hope, though I knew hope could be fragile in a courtroom where money often bent the scales of justice. Still, it was enough to keep me going. One moment stands out vividly in my memory. My uncle's lawyer tried to introduce a stack of documents as evidence, claiming they proved his ownership of my parents' property. But when the papers were handed to the judge, I caught the briefest flicker of doubt cross his face. He asked pointed questions. Who notarized these signatures? Why do the dates not align with the filing? For the first time, I saw my uncle shift in his seat, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the panic underneath. The more they pushed, the more I realized their confidence wasn't invincible. My uncle raised his voice often, interrupting, scoffing, turning red whenever the questions grew uncomfortable. Once, he even slammed his hand on the table, and the judge sternly reminded him, "You will not disrupt these proceedings again." In that moment, the room shifted. The jury straightened in their seats. Reporters scribbled faster, and I felt something stir inside me. Courage I didn't know I had. But courage didn't erase fear. Every time I walked into that courtroom, I wondered if I would leave broken. I wondered if his wealth would buy him another victory, if my voice would be drowned out yet again. The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I refused to let it show. I forced myself to stand tall, to answer clearly, to let the truth speak louder than my trembling hands. Because deep down, I believed the evidence I carried would one day break through the noise. And as the trial moved forward, the anticipation built like thunder on the horizon. The documents I had uncovered, the papers my uncle swore did not exist, were waiting to be revealed. I could see it in the way his lawyers avoided certain questions, in the way he sneered whenever the subject came close. The truth was there, simmering beneath the surface, and I knew that when the moment came, it would not just shake the courtroom, it would expose everything he fought to hide. The courthouse was only one battlefield. The world outside became another. Every morning, I was greeted by flashing cameras, microphones shoved toward my face, and voices shouting questions I couldn't bear to answer. Are you after the money, Sarah? Why are you betraying your own family? Do you hate your uncle? No matter how quickly I walked, no matter how firmly I said, no comment, the questions followed me like a shadow. My picture appeared on the evening news, and strangers on social media dissected my life as though they knew me better than I knew myself. The hardest part wasn't the strangers. It was the family. Cousins I grew up with suddenly refused to speak to me. An aunt I had once loved like a second mother left me a voicemail calling me selfish and cruel. You don't understand what you're doing, she said, her voice trembling with anger. Michael has taken care of this family for decades. Without him, where would we be? Her words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they revealed how deeply my uncle's power ran. He wasn't just a man with money. He was a web that everyone had become entangled in, willingly or not. At night, my apartment felt like a cage. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic. I would sit at the kitchen table with stacks of documents spread before me, staring until the words blurred together. My hands ached from writing notes. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. Sometimes, I whispered to myself, just to break the quiet. "You can do this, Sarah. You have to." Saying it out loud was the only way to convince myself it was true. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, I received an unexpected knock on my door. It was late, and for a moment, fear gripped me. What if it was someone sent by my uncle to intimidate me? But when I opened it, I found one of my father's old friends, Mr. Daniels, standing there with a kind but weary smile. He held a small envelope in his hand. "Your dad wanted you to have this one day," he said softly. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father, written years ago, telling me never to let fear silence me, no matter who stood against me. I cried so hard I could barely read the words. That letter became my talisman. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I read my father's words again and again. They reminded me that this fight wasn't just about documents or inheritance. It was about truth, about not letting lies become stronger than honesty. My father had believed in me, even before I knew I would need to stand against someone like my uncle. And if he could believe, then so could I. Still, the intimidation grew worse. One night, a car slowed down outside my building, its headlights lingering on my window far too long before driving away. Another time, I came home to find a threatening note slipped under my door. "Drop the case or you'll regret it." I showed it to my lawyer, who urged me to stay cautious but not to back down. "This is exactly what they want," he said. "They want you scared enough to quit. Don't give them that satisfaction." His words steadied me, but the fear never fully left. Despite the pressure, there were moments of quiet strength. A neighbor I barely knew stopped me in the hallway one morning, handed me a cup of coffee, and whispered, "Don't let him win." Small gestures like that mattered more than I could explain. They reminded me that while some people doubted me, others silently rooted for me. And sometimes, knowing that even one stranger believed in me was enough to keep walking into that courtroom with my head held high. As the trial neared the point of presenting hard evidence, the atmosphere shifted. Reporters spoke in hushed tones about what might come next. My uncle's lawyers grew sharper, more aggressive, as though they sensed their grip slipping. And my uncle himself? His smile was still there, but it no longer reached his eyes. There was a twitch in his jaw, a restlessness in his posture that hadn't been there before. For the first time, I saw cracks in the armor he had worn all his life. I clung to those cracks like a lifeline, because deep down, I knew the storm was building towards something irreversible. The documents I had uncovered weren't just papers. They were truth written in ink, undeniable and unshakable. And when they finally came into the light, nothing, not money, not lies, not intimidation, would be able to bury them again. The only question that remained was how much destruction they would cause when they landed, and whether my uncle was ready for the world to see him without the mask he had worn for decades. The morning the evidence was scheduled to be presented, the air in the courthouse felt electric. Even the marble floors seemed colder beneath my shoes, as if the building itself knew what was about to happen. Reporters packed the hallway, their cameras ready, their whispers sharp and urgent. When I entered the courtroom, all eyes turned toward me, but I kept walking, forcing myself not to falter. Across the room, my uncle sat with his arms folded, his expression carefully neutral, though his foot tapped against the floor with restless energy. As the proceedings began, my lawyer rose with a stack of files, his hands steady, but his eyes burning with determination. He spoke clearly, laying out the foundation: dates, signatures, and transactions that painted a picture of manipulation. The jury leaned in, their attention sharpening with each word. My uncle's lawyers immediately objected, their voices cutting through the air like knives. "Irrelevant! Speculative! Improper foundation!" but the judge waved them down, reminding them that evidence would be heard in full. The first wall of my uncle's fortress had begun to crack. When the first document was displayed, a property deed supposedly signed by my parents, the courtroom grew tense. The judge studied the signature closely, then looked over his glasses at my uncle. "Mr. Turner," he said slowly, "this signature does not match other verified documents from the same time period. Do you have an explanation?" My uncle adjusted his tie, forcing a chuckle. "People's handwriting changes over time, Your Honor." But the judge's eyes remained cold, unconvinced. The jury scribbled notes, and for the first time, I saw sweat gather on my uncle's brow. One by one, the documents were presented. Bank records that didn't align, contracts notarized by individuals who didn't exist, signatures that forensic experts later confirmed were forged. Each piece added another stone to the growing wall of truth, and with every revelation, my uncle's composure frayed further. His jaw clenched tighter, his interruptions grew louder, until the judge finally slammed his gavel and warned him to remain silent or be removed from the courtroom. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the jury absorbed every detail, their faces shifting from curiosity to suspicion, and finally to disbelief. The image of my uncle, the generous billionaire, the respected patriarch, was dissolving before their eyes. The smirk he had worn so confidently on the first day of trial was gone, replaced by a grimace that betrayed the fear he had always hidden so well. And though I felt a surge of vindication, I also felt the weight of tragedy. This was still my family, still the man who had once told me bedtime stories, and yet he had chosen deceit over love. The climax came when the judge himself held up the final stack of papers. He adjusted his glasses, flipped through the pages, and then spoke in a tone that silenced the room. "These documents not only show inconsistencies, but deliberate fabrication. Mr. Turner, the court will require a full forensic review of your financial dealings." Gasps filled the room, reporters scrambled to write, and my uncle's lawyers paled visibly. My uncle, however, could no longer contain himself. He shot to his feet, his voice booming through the chamber. "She lies! This is all lies!" The echo reverberated, shaking me to my core, but I didn't move. Not this time. The judge's gaze hardened. "Mr. Turner, enough. The documents speak for themselves." His words landed like a hammer. My uncle froze, his face twisted in fury, but he sank back into his chair, his chest heaving. I sat still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart pounding like a drum. For the first time in years, I felt the scales of power shift. Not completely, not finally, but enough to let hope breathe. After the session ended, the courtroom erupted with noise. Reporters shouted questions, family members muttered among themselves, and the jury exchanged glances that carried unspoken judgments. I walked out into the hallway, my knees trembling, but my spirit unbroken. The storm wasn't over, not yet, but the tide had turned. My uncle's mask had slipped, and once the world saw the truth, it would never fit him again. Still, doubt lingered. I knew he wouldn't go down quietly. Men like my uncle never did. They clawed, they fought, they dragged others down with them if they had to. And as much as I wanted to believe the hardest part was over, a voice inside me whispered that the battle ahead could be even more dangerous than what I had already endured. Because exposing a man like him wasn't just about truth, it was about survival. That night, as I lay in bed replaying every moment, I couldn't shake the sound of his voice screaming across the courtroom. "She lies." Those two words echoed in my mind, not as a threat, but as proof of his desperation. The stronger the truth became, the louder his denial grew. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the final act of this trial would push us both to the very edge, where only one of us could stand victorious. The final week of the trial felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see whether I would fall or finally be free. Every morning I woke with my heart pounding, knowing that each step I took into that courtroom brought me closer to an answer that could change everything. The jury's faces had become familiar to me by then. I studied them, searching for clues in their expressions. Some leaned forward with quiet curiosity, others scribbled furiously in their notepads, and a few kept their eyes locked on my uncle as if trying to see through him. The defense tried one last push to regain control. They brought in witnesses, business associates, family friends, who painted my uncle as a generous benefactor. He gave to charities, one testified. He supported his employees during hard times, another insisted. But as each witness spoke, cracks appeared in their stories. My lawyer was relentless, exposing inconsistencies, asking sharp questions that left them fumbling for words. I could see the jury's patience thinning, their eyes narrowing, their pens slowing. The charm my uncle had relied on all his life was slipping through his fingers. Then came the expert witnesses. A handwriting analyst took the stand, calmly pointing out the forgeries, letter by letter, flourish by flourish. A financial investigator explained the irregular bank transfers, tracing them back to shell companies tied directly to my uncle. Charts and graphs were projected for the jury, each one another nail in the coffin of his credibility. I watched as my uncle's face hardened, his fists tightening under the table. He no longer looked like a man in control. He looked like a man cornered, stripped of the illusions he had built around himself. The closing arguments were like a storm. My lawyer stood tall, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "This case is not about greed from the plaintiff," he declared, gesturing toward me. "It is about greed from the defendant. It is about betrayal, about manipulation, and about a man who thought his wealth could hide the truth." His words echoed in the room, heavy with conviction. When he sat down, the silence was thick, broken only by the sound of my uncle shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Then my uncle's lawyer rose, his tone desperate, his arguments repetitive. He spoke of family bonds, of misunderstandings, of supposed loyalty that I had broken. But the words fell flat. I could feel it in the room. The jury was no longer swayed. They weren't looking at me with doubt anymore. Their eyes were on him, dissecting every word, every gesture, every false note in his performance. When the jury left to deliberate, the wait was excruciating. Minutes stretched into hours. I sat in the hallway, my hands trembling, my stomach in knots. My lawyer tried to reassure me, but the uncertainty was unbearable. I thought of my parents, of the sacrifices they made, of the home my uncle had tried to steal. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake, surrounded by papers, of the fear that had stalked me, of the voice in my head that whispered, "You're not strong enough." And then I thought of the truth, undeniable and unshakable, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Finally, the doors opened. The jury filed back in, solemn and deliberate. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the foreperson's words at first. But then the verdict rang clear. Guilty of fraud, guilty of forgery, guilty of deliberate deception. The words struck like lightning. My uncle's face went pale, his jaw slack, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape. There was none. For the first time in my life, I saw him stripped of power, naked before the truth. The judge's voice followed, steady and final. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Sarah Turner. The contested assets will be returned, and further investigation into Mr. Turner's financial dealings will proceed." The gavel struck, and with it, the weight that had pressed on my chest for years finally began to lift. Reporters rushed forward, family members whispered in disbelief, and my uncle sat frozen, his empire unraveling in front of the world. As I walked out of the courtroom, the cameras flashed brighter than ever, voices shouted questions louder than before, but it all felt distant. I wasn't the woman who had walked in weeks earlier, trembling and afraid. I was someone new, someone who had faced the monster in the dark and refused to back down. Justice had been served, but more than that, my voice had been heard. And no matter how much my uncle had tried to bury it, the truth had risen stronger than his lies. When the trial ended and the dust began to settle, I thought I would feel nothing but relief. But the truth is, the silence that followed was just as overwhelming as the chaos that had come before. For weeks, I had lived inside that courtroom, my life reduced to questions, documents, and accusations. And now, standing outside in the sunlight, it felt unreal. People congratulated me. Reporters tried to push microphones toward my face, and strangers whispered words of support. But inside, I was just quiet. Quiet in a way I hadn't been for years. Justice had been served, yes, The assets my uncle had tried to steal were returned. His empire began to crumble under the weight of investigations. The mask he had worn for decades was finally gone. And yet, victory did not feel like celebration. It felt like survival. Because what I had fought for was never just money. It was truth, dignity, the right to say out loud what had been silenced for too long. That was the real inheritance my parents left me, and no one, not even a billionaire uncle, could take it away. Looking back, I realized the hardest part of this battle was not the legal fight. It was standing against the tide of doubt. My own family turned away. Friends disappeared. The world questioned my motives, called me greedy, called me a liar. But I kept going because somewhere deep inside, I knew the truth mattered more than the noise. And that's what I want you to take from my story. No matter how powerful the opposition, no matter how loud the voices telling you to stay silent, your truth has value. Your voice deserves to be heard. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt small, powerless, or silenced by someone who seemed stronger than you, please know you are not alone. I know what it feels like to shake with fear, to wonder if you'll survive the storm, to think your voice is too small to matter. But I also know what it feels like to keep speaking anyway. And when you do, when you refuse to let lies be the final word, something extraordinary happens. The truth finds its way to the surface. I will never forget the sound of the gavel striking, the words of the judge declaring victory, or the look on my uncle's face when his lies collapsed around him. Those memories will stay with me forever. But what matters even more is the reminder that we are stronger than we believe. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you move forward even when fear tries to paralyze you. And if I could do it, trembling and unsure as I was, then you can too. So, if my story touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or if it simply made you believe in justice again, I want to invite you to stay with me on this journey. There are more stories to tell, more truths to uncover, and more battles worth fighting. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join me here, where voices like ours will never be silenced again. Because together, we can keep proving that no matter how loud the lies, the truth will always speak louder.